1mm thick sheets of aluminium. These were mounted to the building via and glued to the PIR installation.
Glued?
UPVC window jambs will be mounted over the original wooden window frame and the installation. It would create a wider window ledge as it covered the extra layers added to the concrete facade. This system was more cost effective compared to others of more expensive options were more fire resistant. The materials used in the refurbishment would be a pretty hefty saving for Kensington and Chelsea TMO, the organisation formed to manage all of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea's housing. Nearly £300,000 in total, a pretty big cost reduction on an £8.7 million refurbishment project. This, and amongst other savings, were the reason for that contract to change in 2014. Regardless, the refurbishment was signed off, and there it stood, tarted up to look pretty. A home for nearly 300 people. A home that should be safe, somewhere to put your stamp on. A place of comfort, family, entertainment, a space for memories, but occasional sadness, but not a death trap. Well, until it was. The fire. It is the evening of the 13th of June 2017, and a resident of flat 16 on the 4th floor is returning home. The time is 23:30, and the Hailu Kebede goes to his living room. The two he is sharing flat 16 with are asleep. Kebede goes to sleep on a mattress in the living room. Shortly after, he is woken up by probably one of your worst nightmares, a fire alarm. He found out that his Hotpoint fridge freezer in the kitchen was on fire. He goes to wake up the two other residents in flat 16. Soon after, at 54 minutes past 12, Kebede makes a phone call to 999. Kebede banged on his neighbours' doors to alert them of the fire, and he began to...
I think like the British, English equivalent of no one.
The first of the London Fire Brigade reached the scene. The fire could be seen glowing through the window of flat 16. With 2 engines on site, another 2 were dispatched. More calls came in, and the advice was given for residents to stay in their flats.
That's
This
stupid.
was because
No. Stay in my flat. No, there's a fire.
There was no
Baby girl, I'm
and
out.
many higher up were not aware of the fire below. The first firefighters entered flat 16 at 1:07. At 1:08, the flames started to melt the UPVC window frames, and fire began licking up outside the tower. The flammable cladding caught alight. The cavity between the cladding and insulation acted as a chimney, sucking the flames up. At 1:14 in the morning, the firefighters started tackling the blaze in flat 16's kitchen, but it was too late, and the flames had most definitely spread. Seeing the unfolding disaster, more engines and an aerial appliance were requested. Water jets from the ground couldn't reach higher than the 4th floor. Smoke had spread to above flat 16 into flat 26. Some residents on the 5th and 6th floors started to evacuate. By 1:18 in the morning, 34 of 293 residents had escaped, and between 1:18 and 1:38, 110 had escaped. The flames spread up further behind the aluminium cladding. By 1:30 in the morning, the fire had spread in a shockingly fast rate and had reached Grenfell's roof. By now, around 20 fire engines had been dispatched to Grenfell. Soon after, Met Police officers arrived to create an exclusion zone, and London ambulances began to arrive to treat the walking wounded. The smoke had spread into the lobbies of several floors. Many were trapped inside their flats by the ever-increasing smoke and flames. The only staircase had filled up with smoke. Between 1:30 and 1:58, only another 20 had managed to escape. The fire continued to spread sideways on the exterior, and by 1:42 had reached the northern side. Firefighters were given flat numbers of confirmed trapped residents. However, communication via radio had broken down. Instead, the rescue efforts relied on runners and slips of paper to inform the fighters where the residents were actually located. This slowed down communications, meaning that firefighters, by the time of reaching the flats, found them to be empty, as residents had fled the smoke. Although many were still on the phone to 999 dispatch, their updated locations couldn't be passed on to those trying to find them. After 2 o'clock in the morning, many desperate residents tried to communicate their location by flashing lights in their flats, and sadly, as many as 4. The final 2 people to be rescued from the blaze were at 6:05 and 8:07 in the morning, but sadly, not everyone had managed to escape. The fire would continue to blaze all the way to the 16th of June.
It's not only to spawn creepers, Wyatt.
The rescue efforts changed to recovery and evidence gathering. A total of 151 homes were destroyed by the fire. These were not just in Grenfell Tower, but also the smaller 3-story blocks adjacent to the high rise. The fire caused 72 deaths, including one who died in hospital a day later, and another who died in January 2018. Many were children, and the disaster cut deep into the local community. Needless to say, an investigation would follow, and this would come in the form of the Grenfell Inquiry, which was announced by the then Prime Minister Theresa May on the 29th of June 2017. And oh boy, it would uncover the neglect that went into that tower. The investigation and inquiry. Soon after the disaster, on the 29th of June, Theresa May announced that Sir Martin Morvick, a retired judge, would take the lead in the inquiry. Grenfell Tower was covered in scaffolding and a protective wrap to help preserve the evidence within. It was pretty clear the start of the fire was the freezer in flat number 16. This melted away the UPVC window frames and jambs that covered the highly flammable insulation. Once this was exposed, fire was then able to spread into the cladding. The investigation quickly found the cladding to be the cause of the rapid spread, but this was not very surprising to many. In 2014, the council were warned of their decision to use this type of cladding and insulation combination, and it was advised to only use it in combination with a non-flammable insulation. It was also known as early as 2012 that Grenfell had
You need to follow instructions from a bedrock farm.
Issues. These included poor emergency lighting, firefighting equipment was improperly maintained, including out-of-date extinguishers and other material going unchecked for years. These issues were just put aside and ignored, hoping they would disappear. Some residents even formed a group called the Grenfell Action Group, and even created a blog. They had, in 2013, published a health and safety report from 2012, raising concerns about the fire safety of the building. The group also pointed out the lack of appropriate escape routes, and that the hallways were allowed to fill with rubbish, blocking off the paths of escape that did exist. In an ever-classy move, in 2013 the council threatened the bloggers with legal action, saying that their posts amounted to defamation and harassment.
Wow, idiots.
Even more tragically, 2 of the blog writers, Mariam El-Ghwari and Nadia Chowkher, would be amongst those who lost their lives in the fire. Now, all of these concerns were apparent in Grenfell way before the refurbishment. It was found during the inquiry that in November 2016, the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority served a fire deficiency notice to the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, listing multiple safety issues at Grenfell that required action to be taken before May 2017. And unsurprisingly, many of these were still not fixed in June. Now, this would be hard to see as anything other than criminally negligent, and on the 27th of July 2017, the Metropolitan Police issued a public notice to residents saying that they had reasonable grounds to suspect that the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation may have committed corporate manslaughter. However, these charges have yet to be raised, as the Grenfell inquiry has only just wrapped up. It is divided into 2 phases. Phase 1
The search of Bedrock Farm.
The source for this video was released in October 2019.
I will say you're probably not going to find the Creeper Farm.
About the refurbishment and the night of the fire. Phase 2 will try and find out who was at fault for allowing the refurbishment to take place.
Jump up and kill them, one hit.
As such, charges are unlikely to materialise until at least 2023 or even 2024. Sadly, this means that it could be 7 years after the disaster until some action was taken legally. Some charges were brought for fraud, however. In a disgusting effort of profit from others' pain, 21 people tried to claim compensation for either being in the tower when they weren't, or for family members who also weren't. They were charged and found guilty and sentenced for their fraudulent activity. But what of the tower now? Well, it's still there, awaiting the end of the inquiry. From there it will be demolished and turned into a memorial for these victims. The disaster shows the end result of negligence, penny pinching and underinvestment. The sum £300,000 saving would be eclipsed by the estimated 200 million to £1 billion in costs associated with the disaster. The disaster would also lead to the UK cladding scandal, which would financially ruin many, as overnight their apartments became worthless due to insurance companies refusing to cover externally.
That guy's a genius when it comes to farms.
To be rehomed or even just evicted, as some
watch his videos. His videos are very good.
There's a whole political, social, and economic side to
What?
this disaster that I haven't even touched. But that's because I don't feel quite qualified enough to speak on it. But I do recommend reading the inquiry report and Phase 2 when it's released. Although you'll probably be saddened and even more likely angered by the story of Grenfell. Now this subject I'm going to give the rating of outright negligent and 9 on my legacy scale. This is a Plain Difficult production. All videos on the channel are Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike licensed. Plain Difficult videos are produced by me, John, in a currently wet and windy corner of South London, UK. If you like this outro song, then please feel free to check it out full on my second channel, Made by John. I've got Instagram and Twitter, so you can check them out if you want to see any random photographs I post up. I'd like to give a very nice, warm thank you to my patrons and YouTube members for your financial support, as well as you, my loyal viewers who always come back every week for your dose of disaster. And all I have to say is, Mr. Music, play so please.
Surfside condominium collapsed in 2021.
White and blue at Goods Furniture and Mattress. Shop good sleep and save on mattress.
Plain Difficult videos are financially supported by the generosity of my Patreon and YouTube members. Members get early ad-free access to videos, usually the Monday or Tuesday before it's released on the main channel. You can also get other perks depending on the pledge, including your name at the end of the video. Right, well thanks for listening to me talk. Back to the normal scheduled dose of, well, me talking.
Let's try fight. Oh, is this that one? It's that one condominium that just collapsed.
So for the past few months, I've been building up to this subject in my previous videos. And this is about the worryingly long list of concrete construction failures in the state of Florida. I believe all I've covered so far failed before it actually was complete. But today's video is an outlier, as it had been completed and occupied for quite a long time. The Champlain Tower's failure also marks the dramatic increase in the number of victims and financial costs. It is also the most recent entry.
Can you make it where those eggs don't hatch?
My name is John, and welcome to Plainly Difficult. Today, we're looking at the Surfside condominium collapse. A place to escape the cold. Surfside in the early 1970s was a retreat for Canadian holidaygoers. It was considerably cheaper than Miami and offered a no-frills, quiet place to get away. One of his Canadians was Nathan Reber. The lawyer come real estate developer from Ontario set about pushing a proposal to Surfside for some new luxury apartments. This was in August 1979, but there was a slight snag at the city. Their sewage system wasn't up to snuff. This had placed a moratorium on new residential developments, but a mere hurdle Reber must have thought, as his development offered $200,000 to the city for the required water upgrade. This was roughly half the total bill the city needed to cough up. The developers wined and dined officials in an effort to speed permits through. In November 1979, the initial proposal for an overall development at Surfside was approved by the city. The original buildings were to be named Champlain North and Champlain South, and the southern tower was placed at 8777 Collins Avenue, Surfside, Florida, with the north a block away. There was also an Art Deco building already standing in between them. This was the site originally of a hotel, which had been bought up by Canadian investors for $475,000 in 1970. And was the site of an earlier failed attempt, which would be taken up in the late 70s by Reber. The project ran into issues in May 1980 when their lead contractor resigned. A new one was brought in, but there was a lot more trouble ahead. The South building by mid-1980 was well underway, but one of its site cranes collapsed, and by the end of the summer, it was discovered that over $10,000 worth of timber had been stolen. At the end of the summer season, a new contractor was hired, Arnold Neckman. The original towers were to be 12 stories high, but in August the developers applied to increase this with the addition of a penthouse level. Architect, interestingly, both men had slightly dodgy pasts, with Friedman having his license suspended in the late 1960s for a dangerous sign structure that had collapsed. Breiterman had also got into hot water in the mid-1970s for signing off a car park without steel reinforcements. In November, the penthouse was apparently approved, but in just the same month, the permit was revoked. The town manager who revoked the license got into hot water himself, being accused of being a peeping Tom. He resigned, and the penthouses were finally allowed once more. The original issue was that Champlain Towers would exceed height restrictions. They had been brought in to try and stop Surfside turning into a mini Miami, with its towering seaside buildings. The town kind of had its hand forced by allowing the extra height, as the developers had already started building them, meaning if they were stopped and pulled down, the city would have had to deal with a hefty lawsuit. The South Tower was completed in 1981, followed by the North a few months later in 1982. Reber would see several lawsuits brought against him for failing to pay for works completed, and even part of the construction consortium that owned the towers also ended up in court with him. Reber did get a pretty good payday, however, with the sale of the apartments, some $22.5 million, making him one of the largest developers in Florida. So what was the design of the Champlain Towers, most notably the South one?
Realtors understand that it's not just the most important decision you may ever make, it's your American dream.
The design. As we know, during its turbulent construction, the South Tower underwent several changes, and this is reflected in the changes to the building's plans between 1979 and 1980. Some were rather worrying, where support beams were removed in the building's final iteration. The tower was, when looking down into it, in the shape of an L and had 12 stories with penthouses on top. It had a total of 136 apartments, varying in size from 1 to 4 bedrooms. The eastern side of the building had lovely views of the Atlantic Ocean. The building was constructed of steel reinforced concrete. It made use of a standard column and two-way slab design. Slabs were between 9.5 and 8 inches thick. The slab were reinforced with rebar, and at the point that the column connected with the horizontal floor with rebar went through the column's rebar cage. The columns in the building ranged in size, but for the purpose of this video, I'll only talk about 3 types, named A, C and N. Type A columns were largely around the southeast side of the building and were 24 inches square. Type C were predominantly located at the north perimeter and central areas and were 16 inches square. Type N were 8 by 16 inches and were placed on the southeastern perimeter underneath the pool deck and on the western perimeter. Oh yeah, did I mention the complex had a pool deck? This area was on the first floor and housed the heated pool and a number of planters, creating a nice outside area without the need to venture onto the beach. However, the planters, the very heavy planters, were not actually originally spec'd out in the plans. This caused extra stress over the smallest columns, which rather worryingly was where some of the beams had been removed in the plans. The waterproofing for the pool deck was placed on a flat surface instead of with a slope. This would prove troublesome as the building aged, not allowing water to properly run off. The building's columns were supported by piles that had been driven into the ground. This acted as an anchor holding the building in place. Above the pilings was the lowest accessible section of the building, the car park. It had the rough footprint of the building above and was accessed via a ramp. Issues. So not only did the project see issues with the city in getting permits and the like, but problems arose with the plans right from the start. The columns in some places were too narrow on the plans, which meant the contractor would have to make a choice. Use the narrow columns and overcrowd the rebar, increasing the risk of corrosion, or remove some rebar, which weakened the structure. Of course, there was the option of refusing to build it, but we all know that wouldn't have happened. Clearly, parts of the building were not up to code. However, this didn't stop construction, and as we know, the building was actually completed in 1981. But that wasn't the end of the issues. Almost right from the start, after the first residents started moving in, cracks started appearing.
What? Do you have your chest labeled?
In the car park level concrete. Seawater was known to seep through the foundations at high tide, causing the car park to be constantly damp. And, in particularly bad days, could be up to 2 feet deep. Pumps were employed to combat this, but it was a persistent problem on site. But it wasn't just the car park that had standing water and seepage. The roof also had constant complaints of leaks. Over the years, the building fell into disrepair, and to hinder any repairs, the Condo Association was mired in arguments, stalemates and cost-cutting. You see, the Condo Board was a volunteer organisation, usually made up of people who were owners and residents themselves. As such, this often means they aren't the most professional property managers. Because of this, professionals are brought in and are paid from a reserve fund that the board collects. In the UK, this is what the sinking fund is.
There you go.
Do you call that
I'm
the
gonna
same
work on
thing
this
in the US
part
as well?
right here.
Anyway, the board, by the time the apartments were approaching their 40th year, was very low on money. This meant that when repairs were required, the board had to go directly to the residents for the money. Rather than being spread out over months and years of ownership, you might get hit with a massive bill. As such, residents and the board's relationship broke down. Board meetings would erupt into arguments and votes would be blocked, all while the tower deteriorated. Many of the exterior railings of the tower were rusting away. Constant leaks in the car park and cracking columns were a concern to many. Eventually, the board managed to get an assessment done on the building's deteriorating condition. And no surprises, it wasn't good news. Morabito Consultants issued a report on the building in 2018, noting major construction errors on the pool deck, cracking and spalling in the car park, facades cracking, soffits rotting, window seals failing, improper flashing of doors and windows causing leaks, and serious cracks on the columns revealing rebar were all major points.
Oh, that's not
Raven said
pleasant.
that parts of the building, especially around the pool deck, were beyond their useful life. So none of that was good, and the bill for repairs wouldn't be any better. This would result, again, in arguments and frustration with the condo board. And in 2019, 6 of the 7 board members resigned. A new round of board members took over in 2020 and managed to secure a $15 million loan for the repairs, which, nearly 2 years after the report, had grown in need and cost. Put across. But how would this multi-million-dollar loan be paid off? Well, the residents would have to bear the cost in what's called a special assessment. This put condo owners on the hook for between $80,000 and $200,000 depending on the apartment size, paid up front or monthly for 15 years. But although falling apart and with expensive repairs due, the Champlain Towers location and views still made it an attractive investment opportunity for prospective buyers. Several properties sold over the next year, including one of the penthouses for close to $3 million. In April 2021, the special assessment bills were sent out to residents. But for the residents, it wasn't just a financial disaster on the horizon.
Yeah. I remember this being in the news when that tower just collapsed.
The collapse. It is the early hours of the 24th of June 2021, and passers-by near the Champlain Towers south hear noises from the building that sounds like a car crash. A tourist films through the gate to the garage, where rubble and water can be seen pouring onto the ground. Residents inside the building are awoken by cracking, as one person would describe as construction-like sound. This is around 1:14 in the morning, and the noises were increasing. At roughly 1:21 in the morning, the ground floor deck gave way, followed by the central portion of the northern side of the building. Shortly after, the eastern section also plunged into the darkness. The dramatic collapse happened in just 12 seconds. The western section of the building surprisingly remained precariously in place. Within minutes, the first responders arrived on the scene, and in one of the gruesome modern wonders, the disaster's aftermath was recorded with body cameras. The air in the immediate aftermath was thick with dust, obscuring street lighting in the night sky. Over 80 emergency response units would race to the scene immediately and begin frantically trying to recover any survivors. Within hours, hundreds of police officers and firefighters from agencies across Miami-Dade were in attendance. Survivors were carried from the standing portion of the building and severely damaged sections, stretchers, and even on the first responders' backs. A cherry picker was employed in an effort to reach people trapped on the higher sections of the remaining structure. Evacuations took place in the hotel next door. Luckily, due to the building being flanked by the beach on the east side, no one else was at risk within the immediate vicinity. As the hours dragged on, more specialist rescue units began scouring the wreckage, but it wasn't looking good. Rescue dogs sniffed over the rubble. 35 people were rescued in the first few hours. An on-site triage was set up, and various levels of wounded were treated on-site and sent off to hospitals across the Miami-Dade area. A state of emergency declaration was signed by the Miami-Dade County Mayor at 4:33 p.m. By the evening, the missing list was increasing in length. A fire had broken out within the depths of the rubble and was spreading horizontally. By the 26th of June, 127 people had been accounted for. 5 were confirmed dead and 156 missing. Champlain Towers North was voluntarily evacuated due to it being built around the same time with the same developer. This also happened alongside the evacuation of Champlain East, which was built in the 1990s. The still standing portion of Champlain South was announced to be demolished on the 4th of July, and this would be using explosives. It was planned for the structure to fall into its footprint and into Collins Avenue to try to not disturb the recovery efforts on the east part of the site. For the best part of a month, rescue workers would continue scouring the site for survivors. However, it was more a case of body recovery. On some days, just one body, and on others, as many as 15 would be retrieved. By the
That's
17th
nice.
of July, 97 bodies have been pulled from the rubble, with all but 2
Sheesh.
being identified. On the 23rd of July, the Miami-Dade Fire Department stopped the rescue efforts and left the area. By now, all 98 were identified. Vital evidence in the form of important structural debris was removed and stored off-site for investigation. Some of the damaged cars and personal property from the tower was transported to a field 10 miles away. Surprisingly, in 2022, the site was sold off for redevelopment for $120 million to Dubai-based developer Damac. But what was the cause of the collapse?
Any years of wear?
The investigation. Now, this might actually be the first subject I've covered on this channel, but the investigation hasn't actually been complete. It has fallen on the feet of the NIST. But although there isn't an official verdict yet, we can go into the most likely causes. As investigators and the media dug into the parts of the building, unsurprisingly, the building's tumultuous history came to light. The 2018 report was made public information, but although it highlighted many serious issues, not all could have caused the initial spark that caused the collapse. Luckily, there was some footage of the building pre-disaster, the collapse beginning at the base of the building. This was because, as you can see, the upper floors stayed intact as they fell, meaning their supports had gone closer to the bottom of the building. This, coupled with the footage of rubble in the car park pre-collapse, showed that the initiator was likely around here. The second part of the collapse, as seen on the video, shows us that the middle section removed the support for the eastern section. The western section didn't collapse. This also gives us a hint. But it was built slightly differently, with stronger columns of their Type A variety at 24 inches square. The shear walls on each side of the central section were different, with the western wall being thicker than its eastern counterpart. Post-collapse photos also hinted at a cause of the overpopulated concrete with rebar, most notably in the narrower columns. This meant that the concrete didn't fill the gaps in between the rebar, allowing air pockets to form, potentially creating areas that said rebar could corrode. They also found on the concrete floor slabs that some had delaminated from their rebar. That is, the rebar had pulled away from within the concrete floor slabs. But we already knew the building wasn't very well built. But it did last 40 years. Well, this is where poor maintenance comes into play. With not addressing the gradually appearing issues over the 4 decades, the built-in flaws would only make themselves worse. For example, not painting the concrete at regular intervals to protect it from the corrosive seaside air.
Yeah, because
Anything
seaside
neglected
area,
will eventually
saltwater area is pretty
fail. The building
corrosive.
during its lifetime had rather a lot of construction projects undertaken around it. The aforementioned Champlain Towers East was thrown up in the 1990s. Also next door, there was the 2016 87 Park, which began construction. And in 2019, a beach replenishment project was undertaken, which would involve large heavy trucks of sand being brought along the 88th Street, which was along the building's northern perimeter, exactly near where the collapse had begun. It was also found that during the 90s, Champlain Towers South was experiencing subsidence of just under 1 millimetre per year. Although leading up to the disaster, this had seemed to have stopped. There had been reports of the pool deck having issues with, in the 1990s, the concrete underneath the pool needing repair from the car park side. This involved removing the damaged concrete and rust-proofing the rebar, then sealing it in with mortar. Spooling had to be repaired in 1997, again around the underside of the pool deck, and waterproofing was also looked at. Personally, I think the issue was inadequate concrete and rebar specifications, which allowed to weaken beyond the point of holding itself up due to woeful maintenance in an area which loves to rust things away, i.e. by the sea. But hey, what do I know? I'm just an idiot on the internet. The official cause we will still have to await from the NIST. So now I need to look at the aftermath. A lawsuit was filed against Champlain Towers South Condominium Association on the 24th of June 2021, initially for $5 million, and this will be joined over the months by many more residents. It will result on June 23rd, 2022, with a $1.02 billion settlement for victims of the collapse. It was estimated that the collapse also caused around $1 billion in property damage, making it one very expensive disaster. Would help associations keep on top of maintenance and holding enough funds in for repairs. So I'm going to call this disaster an absolute dumpster fire. And, unfortunately, due to the event being so recent, I'm not going to give it a legacy scale just yet. This is a Playlistful production. All videos on the channel are created from that we should share like license. Playlistful videos are produced by me, John, in the currently surprisingly sunny corner of southern London, UK. I'd like to thank my Patreon members and
20 years of lice, the worst, dude. That, the worst. The Mad Cow BSE scandal.
when this event hit the headlines, I was around 5 to 6 years old. Although I didn't really grasp what it was, I could tell from my parents' faces that it wasn't a good thing. All the beef burgers in the freezer were thrown in the bin, and we were only allowed to eat fillets of fish whenever we went to McDonald's. Subconsciously, this must have influenced my becoming a vegetarian in my early teens. Nowadays, there are hundreds of veggie-friendly options. But back in 2001 and 2002, it was a little bit more difficult. Well, that's enough talking about my dietary choices. Let's get started with the video. Piles of bodies are burning in fields all throughout the British countryside. It is the 1990s, and this hellish scene is scarring the British pride in their farming products. The mass culling is understandably no one's first choice, but it seems the only way to stamp out an animal-borne disease that has made the leap to humans. The cattle farming industry makes up roughly 38% of the UK's entire agricultural product, and the last thing the country needs is piles of dead, unsellable cows. The disease is always fatal, with a prognosis of roughly 13 months after onset of symptoms. It is officially known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which, if consumed infected meat, can cause variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, more casually known as mad cow disease. Welcome to Scandal, a plainly difficult documentary series.
Interesting.
Background. It is the 1940s, and the United Kingdom, as well as the rest of the world, is collecting itself after nearly 6 years of devastation. War has bludgeoned the UK economy. Industry has been stripped of resources and manpower, and a victorious, yet now poor nation seeks some way to move forward. The country is in debt, and has been operating under rationing for many of the essentials for the average British person's diet: sugar, meat, fats and cheese. At the start of the war, Britain was importing half of its meat, 80% of its fruit and 70% of its cereals and fats from abroad. As such, this became the wake-up call for the UK to become more food independent, as well as build thriving rural communities and economies. Successive governments fostered this economic development. The growth continued in the 1970s, with the UK joining the EEC. Now there was an even bigger reason to farm more: tariff-free trading. The UK, by the 1980s, had achieved over 100% domestic milk demand and 97% meat demand. Quite a turnaround of importing 50% some 40 years before. This market was worth £5 billion to the UK economy. But how was this turnaround achieved? Well, glad you asked, as this would prove to be a vital cog in the wheel of disaster. The UK had made use of a scheme of selective breeding to create cattle with the ability to produce more milk, coupled with a high-protein diet. The industry found that soya-based feed was good, but not good enough. Instead, they discovered that meat and bone meal yielded as good, if not better, milk produce than the more natural alternative. And what was better was that it was made of animal waste and was as such a hell of a lot cheaper than soya. You may ask what those waste products are. Well, I don't think you're going to like it. Imagine every bit of livestock that you think you would normally throw in the bin. You know, the bones, blood, and pretty much everything else left over, but vitally also the brain as well. It was all mashed together to make feed. Much of the livestock products
Yeah.
used were from cows. So basically, the industry was feeding cows cows. The high protein feed was mainly for increasing
Okay.
milk production, and as such, dairy cows
That's not
were the
favorable.
most unknowingly
The
cannibalistic
bone.
population in the farm
That's
industry.
awful. Well, that is just straight up messed up. The cow industry was feeding cows. Cows. They're taking bones, blood, and all that garbage, mounted it up, and then they fed it to. Wow. Well, humans are just truly horrible.
But these dairy cows would eventually find themselves in the slaughterhouse.
Yeah, whatever.
as around
Chickens are
2/3
okay
were
because I hate
eventually
chickens.
used for beef production. For cattle to enter the human food chain, they had to be killed in a licensed
Right.
slaughterhouse in the UK. But the numbers in the country had dwindled to around 1,000 registered premises by the 1980s. The side effect was that cattle had to travel longer distances. Now, I'm not going to describe the slaughterhouse process, but it should be said that the waste products that made up meat and bone feed came as a byproduct from the rendering process, part of the whole meat production line. Rendering is a process of recovering any waste products from livestock, and vitally for our story in the 1980s, was completely unregulated in the UK, and thus diseased animals quite often found themselves being turned into feed.
Dunkin' salted caramel cold brew. Sweet and creamy. And topped with a burnt sugar crunch. I said, watch it do my shake.
I can't wait to get
1983,
this done.
an unknown illness. It is October 1983. Veterinarian Mr. Ray Williams is attending a cow that has been exhibiting some strange behaviour. He is at Coleman Farm in Wiltshire, and over the next year, Williams would see at least 5 more cows exhibiting very similar symptoms. The animals are showing signs of distress, shaking, poor coordination, and trembling of the head. The cows, although showing normal hunger, were also losing weight. The animals were destroyed, and thus no autopsy was made, but these few victims would prove to be just the start of a mysterious condition. In January 1985, Mr. Williams discovered another cow on the
What?
same farm but a different
Farming?
unit, exhibiting the same strange symptoms.
Farming?
Not wanting to miss out on finding out what the cause was, he sent his cow, which would now be named Cow 36, to a veterinary school in Langford. The animal was slaughtered and given a partial post-mortem. In the report, the cow was stated to have aggressive nervous signs, hyperemesia, tremors, mania, and hind leg ataxia. But whilst Williams was dealing with this strange illness, little did he know that another farm called Pitcham, over 100 miles away in Sussex, had an animal showing the very same strange symptoms. Cow 133, as it was officially known, was observed in December 1984 to have lost all its coordination and was experiencing severe shaking. 6 weeks later, it died, much to the confusion of local veterinarian Mr. David B. B, like Williams, at the same time would see several more cows showing the same symptoms, almost like it was spreading amongst the farm's population. B coined the new illness Stent Farm Syndrome after the owner of the farm, Peter Stent, and sent a number of tissue samples to the Central Veterinary Laboratory. The first officially diagnosed case of BSE was from cow number 142. Pathologist Carol Richardson examined the cow and saw similarities with the samples that B had sent in previously. She diagnosed the illness as a bovine scrapie, which was confirmed by the consultant pathology unit. As a side note, scrapie is a known condition, even known as early as 1732. It is fatal, and is a degenerative disease affecting the nervous systems of sheep and goats, but it is not known to be consumed. The name comes from the behaviour of the infected individual scraping or autopsy results will be reviewed a number of times. One such was in June 1987, when it was confirmed the illness was a form of transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, or the less of a mouthful BSE. A couple of months later, the UK government would accept the new disease, but although the cause of the strange symptoms was discovered, an unknown number of cattle had been infected. Although the early signs were there from 1983, it is now thought to have occurred in cows as early as the 1970s. It's very likely it was spread through the meat and bone meal that was fed to cattle, and in the late 1980s, the numbers of infected animals would soar as more and more unknowingly infected cattle were slaughtered and rendered.
Dude.
However, when the causal link was suggested, in 1988, meat bone meal was banned for feeding to cattle. But by now, hundreds of thousands of cattle were potentially infected with mad cow disease. The British Ministry of Agriculture accepted that it had a new disease, but it was very slow to act, only banning offal for human consumption in 1989, which was suggested by the Southwood Report. The Thatcher government, sorry I said that wrong, didn't I? The Thatcher government were adamant that British beef was safe among the concerns over BSE, saying the illness couldn't jump species. But experiments at Oxford University had already shown the disease could infect other species, when in 1988 mice were infected with BSE by a brain-to-brain injection. The Southwood Report also advised that the government should slaughter and dispose of any cow that was suspected to have transmitted the disease. The government complied, but only offered a 50% compensation to farmers, which seemed like a bit of a half-assed measure, especially when BSE can take several years to manifest any symptoms after infection. The lack of financial incentive led
Dude, if I were making a zombie apocalypse map, this building would be overpowered. It's got tons of rooms in it.
In 1989, banned British beef from its shores. The government by 1990 was assuring the British public and the wider world market that British beef was safe to eat. The Conservative government said there was no evidence of catching the disease through the consumption of meat. Well, until there was.
Typical politician movement.
Hello, John here. Have you ever wondered who made the racket in the background to this video, or the other Scandal episodes, or even the outro songs on pretty much every recent Plain Difficult episode? Well, wonder no more, as it was made by me, John. And you can now listen to the songs in full on my new YouTube channel, made by John, stream them on Spotify, or even if you fancy, buy them to keep forever on Beatport and iTunes. I enjoy making my personal mix of acid house, breakbeat and ambient, and I hope you'll enjoy listening to it as much as I did making it. Max the cat and the jump to humans. Enter Siamese cat, Max. The feline had for most of its life been given a diet of British beef. Not so strange. However, what made Max unique was that he began exhibiting symptoms congruent with a feline form of BSE. Max was confused, losing weight, had trouble keeping balance, and the signature of the illness, uncontrolled quivering. The cat became the first known case outside of a laboratory of BSE jumping species. Scientists knew it was possible. In the same year, they had shown mice could develop the condition through eating infected food. BSE had now officially jumped species. Max and a number of other cats, including a tiger, became infected, showing the risk of transmitting the disease through consumption of infected meat. Despite the ever-growing storm clouds of thousands of cows developing BSE, the UK government doubled down with the line that British beef was still safe.
The Agriculture Minister, John Gummer, today enrolled his daughter, Cordelia, in his campaign to persuade people that eating beef is safe. It was a little hot for her.
Wow, good job. Make your little kid eat meat that could be infected. That's a good
There's
move.
nothing to worry about.
Secretary of State for the Environment, John Gummer, appeared on
This-
TV.
this
virtually
guy-
forcing
this,
his daughter's
guy
beef
fed
burning.
her,
Nothing like dragging
fed his
children into
daughter
politics
meat
at a
in
young
order
age.
to
And guess what happened to him?
a point that can't
He
jump to
eventually got
humans.
made
Good
a
job.
member of the House
Typical
of Lords.
politician move right there.
Anyways, no matter how much head in the sand stances the government made, by 1992, an estimated 100,000 cattle had become infected with BSE. This amounted to roughly 3 in every 1,000 cows having the potential to be infected. Between 1992 and 1993, some 4.4 million cattle had been slaughtered and disposed of, mainly by burning the corpses in the fields of the British countryside. This proved to be financially decimating for the British farming sector, and as such, the government continued to claim the safety of British beef, with the chief medical officer reaffirming the safe-to-eat party line. Even though the numbers of the infected reached the peak of the outbreak, the human tragedy was yet to unfold. In late 1994, a few people in Britain were showing symptoms of a rare illness, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, so rare per year in the UK. Well, what's so strange, you might think? Rare illnesses exist. What is odd is that traditionally the condition rarely affects anyone under the age of 55, and the new victims were nearly 1990s. There are at least 4 cases of farm workers all over the age of 55 being taken ill with CJD, which proved to be
And
a
there
very
it
strange
is.
coincidence.
That
It was
school
kind
is
of looking
done.
like there was a vocational link to cattle and CJD. A 19-year-old man named Stephen Churchill
I just watched a
died
cat
in
fall
May
off the building and
1995,
despawn.
apparently linked to this rare illness. A younger 16-year-old girl had been identified around the same time, but Devon was the first of the under.
That is one of the coolest looking buildings I've ever made.
Needless to say, that unusual deaths in young people often warrant thorough autopsies. James Ironside, a pathologist at the National CJD Surveillance Unit, saw the brains of the patients and showed unusual spongiform symptoms. He named this new condition variant CJD, or VCJD. In total, in 1995, 4 people would die from VCJD, but in September, the government stated that there was insufficient evidence to link BSE and VCJD. But eventually, on the 20th of March 1996, the government would begrudgingly capitulate, and Stephen Dorrell, the Secretary of State for Health, said there was actually a link between VCJD and infected beef. 7 days later, the EU would enact a ban on British beef. But why did children get so much of the issues? Well, the Thatcher government in the 1980s had removed the requirement for school dinners to have any nutritional value. As such, schools were using mechanically recovered meat, which was not much better than meat bone meal. In response to the EU ban on British beef, the UK sought to legally challenge the export ban and introduced a scheme to slaughter and destroy all cattle over the age of 30 months. This rift between the UK and EU during this period, which heavily affected the UK farming economy, has been argued to be one of the sparks that started off the Brexit movement, of which a large number of farmers voted for in the EU referendum. Millions of cattle burned in the fields of the UK countryside as the UK government attempted to get a hand.
Oh my god. Woo. Tornado outbreak in Canada right now. 5 tornadoes. One is in Pennsylvania and the other one's in Kansas. I am. You do have a storm developing. It's kind of medium strength. It is not tornado warned, but it does have severe portions to the south, which are heading towards which are in Georgia, northern Georgia, you should be okay. But again, storms look like they're going to be a little bit strong today.
On the outbreak. However, British beef was still on the menu in British butchers, albeit not allowing to be sold on the bone, but there was still risk to people. In 1997, local councils stopped serving beef in roughly 2,000 schools across the country. Over the next 20 years, 178 people would go on to contract and die of the disease. But let's quickly pause here to discuss VCJD and how it affects the human body. VCJD. The contraction of VCJD has appeared to be a bit of a lottery of genetics, as millions of people ate infected meat, but there are under 200 known deaths. Clearly the odds are low, although you'd never like to know your chances when you're taking the spin on the roulette wheel of death. VCJD is caused by things called prions, officially called proteinaceous infectious particles. They are misfolded proteins that have the ability to transmit their misfolded shape onto normal variants of the same protein.
Prions, I think, are
In an
uncommon
uninfected person,
diseases
as a string
types.
of amino acids that then fold themselves into three-dimensional shapes. Sometimes during protein folding, issues can happen, and the prion protein can't be used by the body. These are usually recycled, but can cause issues if large enough quantities build up. After eating infected meat, the malicious prions infect healthy brain proteins in the body.
Wait, what's your base chords?
More misfolded prions. In doing so, this kills off brain cells.
Now what's your temple
Naturally, the
chords?
dying of brain cells creates reduced cognitive and physical functions. What is scary is that these dangerous prions can survive in the nerve tissue, such as brain or spinal cord, for a long time after death, which if eaten, breeds for disease. Potentially, VCJD can lie dormant in your body for many years. As such, some countries have bans on
Negative
British
what?
citizens
Negative
donating
88,
blood
and
if
what's
they
the
lived
Z
during
coordinate?
crisis. But was there any accountability for the continued sale and denial of infected meat? The inquiry. At the height of the disaster, an inquiry
The
was
nearest
announced in
amethyst
December
geode,
1997.
another one is at
The
negative
government
124, and then
Blair had
68.
been in power since May the same year. In his executive summary, published in October by Nick Brown, the Secretary.
There's two more. There's one at, you want to note this down? Negative 156, 84, and negative 172, 116. Is that a copy of your world? There's a possible zombie spawner. Yeah, there is a skeleton spawner right under that one. If you go to negative 155, 44, and the coordinates, and you go y coordinate negative 31, there should be a spider spawner. There's three spawners and three. There's a few spawners in that little area of island you have.
Repeatedly reassured that it was safe to eat beef. Some statements failed to explain that the views expressed were subject to proper observance of the precautionary measures which had been introduced to protect human health against the possibility that VSE might be transmissible. These statements conveyed the messages not merely that beef was safe, but that VSE was not transmissible. The inquiry also slated the government for its lack of consideration for the amount of infected material needed to be eradicated from the meat. More serious was a failure to give rigorous consideration to the amount of infected material that was proving capable of transmitting the disease. The false assumption was made that any cross-contamination of cattle feed in feed mills from pig or poultry feed containing ruminant protein would be onto a small-scale matter. As the 90s came to a close, the numbers of infected cattle were reduced, as the population of cows were essentially eradicated from the UK. Restrictions on beef were slowly raised. Meat on the bone and offal was still restricted well into the mid-2000s, even for UK markets, and the EU would lift its ban in 2006 after a 10-year embargo on British beef, although France continued to impose a ban on British beef illegally long after. Plainly summary. Personally, it seems like the government at the time was, during the reigns of two Conservative Prime Ministers, Thatcher and John Major, were more willing to play down and in some cases outright ignore the warning signs to the risk of millions of British citizens. All of this was to try and prop up a significant portion of the UK economy. Incompetence, profits, over safety, or a bit of both will be up to you to decide. But regardless, many hundreds will pay the price and maybe still will. This is a Plain Difficult production. All videos on the channel are Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike licensed. Plain Difficult videos are produced by me, John, in a currently nice corner of southern London, UK. Help the channel grow by liking, commenting and subscribing. I'd like to thank my patrons and YouTube members for your support. And also, if you enjoyed any of the music in this video, you can listen to it on my second channel, made by John. Stream it on Spotify, or even if you feel like, buy it on iTunes. As such, all of the links are in the description below. And all that's left to say is, Mr. Music, play us out, please.
Oh, I've seen that. Gary, Indiana.
Explore more in a new
I will
Mazda.
warn you if you ever... Gary, Indiana. That's right. Show Anakin that you have high ground. Have you ever heard of Gary, Indiana? Yeah, it's not in Illinois, buddy. Gary, Indiana. Don't go there. It's miserable. It's crime-ridden. Murder rates are high. Crime rates are high.
Beauty during this season of discovery.
With Beyond Natural Pet Food, you can feed your pet nutrition as nature intended. Beyond brings you options with natural, organic, and sustainably sourced ingredients, so you can choose what's best for your pet. Learn more at BeyondPetFood.com.
This video is sponsored by Morning Brew. This is the road that leads to Gary, Indiana. Or at least it used to. A while back, the neighboring city of Hammond was resurfacing this road and decided it was better to add a berm at the end of it so it didn't lead to Gary anymore. The fewer the connections, the better, was the thinking. And when you do get into Gary, it feels like a whole different world. It's emptier, quieter, with vacant homes and overgrown lots. It's like a city forgotten, despite being in one of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States.
And it's literally has I-90 going through it, which is all the much weirder.
In the stunning, if crumbling, architecture. This steep decline in fortunes led Business Insider to label Gary the most miserable city in the United States in 2019. They based their rankings on statistics like unemployment and poverty rates. Business Insider is only the latest in a long line of publications dissing the city. Time magazine called Gary, Indiana, the very model of urban decay. As early as the 1950s, it was described as full of sin, crime, and open immorality. This immorality was shrouded in a black pall of smoke from the steel mills. In 1994, Gary was dubbed the murder capital of the U.S., as it had the highest rate of murders per capita of any city in the country. Today, it doesn't even crack the top 10 most dangerous places in Indiana, let alone the United States. It feels hollowed out, as its population has dropped from 178,000 in 1960 to just 69,000 today.
Of course.
Now, Gary's story is a lot like other Rust Belt cities in the United States, but the fall here was greater. Now, one question I have, because I'm a bit of an optimist, is there a turnaround in store for Gary? So let's talk about Gary's history and its future after the bike belt. This video is actually a personal one for me because my wife is from Northwest Indiana, from this region, and my father-in-law was actually born and raised here in Gary. I used to drive to college through this area and wondered who lived here, and it turns out my future wife did, and now I'm spending a lot of my vacation time here in Gary in Northwest Indiana. So I've always been fascinated with this city, and I'm so excited to be doing a video about it. So let's get into the history.
If you drive through Gary on Interstate 90, you can't miss Gary Works. It was the largest steel mill in the world for many years, and is still the largest in North America. Pittsburgh may be known as the Steel City, but no city's fortunes have been tied closer to steel than Gary. In fact, U.S. Steel founded Gary, and the name comes from Albert Gary, the founding chairman of U.S. Steel. Its location at the southern end of Lake Michigan is no accident. U.S. Steel owned iron mines throughout the region, and this area could receive shipments via Great Lakes Freighter or railroad. The Standard Oil refinery in nearby Whiting proved a model for U.S. Steel, as it succeeded in the same strategic location. The city was founded in 1906, and the mills produced their first steel in 1909. U.S. Steel understood that they needed to build a city for its workers, as it was too far away from Chicago for regular daily commuting before the freeway era. They needed to build a company town, and Gary would eventually grow to be the largest company town in the United States. Many past company towns came with a big dose of paternalism. Company founders would want to create cities to ensure its residents were moral, upstanding, diligent workers. This often meant that the company owned the homes the workers lived in and the stores they shopped at. Great for the company, not so great for the workers. One famous example is nearby Pullman, Illinois, home of the company that built fancy railroad cars. It was by all accounts a nice-looking village, and George Pullman hoped it could be a model for urban planning. But when the factory had to cut hours due to lower demand for the rail cars, they didn't cut rents or prices in the company's stores. Workers rose up, and the ensuing Pullman strike is one of the defining events of the U.S. labor movement. The Illinois Supreme Court ruled that the company had to divest its ownership of non-factory property, and the city was annexed into Chicago. This all happened in 1894, only 12 years before Gary was founded. U.S. Steel wanted to avoid that outcome. Thus, Gary was planned as a community where workers would own their own homes and democratically elect their own completely separate city government. The lack of paternalistic vision was probably wise, but it led to a rather bland urban design. Fifth Avenue and Broadway were the two major thoroughfares, with Broadway leading directly to Union Station and U.S. Steel. The rest of the city was divided up into a grid with 40 houses per block, connected by streets that were quite wide, at 80 to 100 feet. There was one big problem with the plan to have employees own their own houses. Most employees did not make enough to build a home or buy a newly built one. Many workers ended up in tents, or 3-room shacks that could house up to 20 workers. U.S. Steel got into home construction to try and house more workers, but even their modestly priced housing was out of reach of the lowest paid unskilled workers. Land promoters and speculators built ramshackle barracks and tenement housing to fill the gap. The fledgling city government had no regulations that required amenities like running water, so they were absolutely terrible places to live. Gary may have avoided the paternalistic model of Pullman, but created their own sort of urban anarchy. The situation was made worse by a lack of public open space. The mills spread across the entirety of Gary's lakeshore, so there's no recreation there. The only recreation, it seemed, could be found in the local taverns. By the 1910s, there was one tavern for every 88 Gary residents.
Oh my
Even
god.
at this early stage in the history of Gary, it had a reputation for being bigger than life, an industrial colossus, but also a den of sin, filled with low-wage single men spending what little they had on alcohol and gambling.
Nice. And I have
trail sports. He made it
chunk face.
With features like an enhanced all-wheel drive system.
From this inauspicious start, Gary grew with the fortunes of the steel industry. The population doubled between 1920 and 1940 and reached a peak of 178,000 in 1960. With population growth came demographic change. Much of the early growth had been from Eastern European immigrants, often discriminated against by white workers who had been in the country for a generation or more. Those Eastern European immigrants forged tight-knit communities that characterized Gary's
those immigrants
Gary was also
worked
a destination
super
for Southern
hard.
black workers as a part of the Great Migration, a demographic shift that saw millions of black Americans resettling in industrial cities of the North. As the new minority in town, black workers faced discrimination, and by the 1940s and 1950s, white workers had begun to move out of Gary to nearby suburbs, an example of the white flight phenomenon. This exodus became a flood after 1967. This was a mayoral election year, and incumbent Mayor Martin Katz had the endorsement of the Democratic Machine and Union Steelworkers. But black residents favored Richard Hatcher, a moderate who campaigned on ending patronage and cleaning up corruption. Hatcher won, becoming, with Carl Stokes of Cleveland, the first black mayors of major American cities. Many white residents took that as their cue to leave, not willing to live in a city where black residents made up the majority,
Get over yourself.
and having a mayor that was also black.
Oh
Gary's
no,
population declined
a
between
black mayor,
1960
what will
and
it just
1970,
get over
the first
yourselves,
time in its
people?
history. Meanwhile, Gary became the center of the black political landscape.
Why are people so
hosting the
paranoid?
1972 Black Political Convention. Black residents of Gary during this time were proud of their
Oh
city
no,
art.
there's a person who's a different color who's being elected. Like, okay, then why is that bad? I'm waiting. Oh wait, never mind, I'm sorry, you can't come up with it. You can't. The what?
Have some measure of political control. It's unfortunate, then, that this change in political landscape came at the exact moment U.S. Steel began to lay off its workers. In 1967, 65% of Gary workers were employed at Gary Works. That's an insanely high percentage for one employer. During this era, 30,000 people worked there. But Gary's steel mills began to fall victim to deindustrialization. This is when one region's industries decline, often because it becomes cheaper to import the same
There's a
goods
thing
from
called the
somewhere
Rust Belt.
else. This phenomenon struck the entire Rust Belt of the U.S. hard, but perhaps none as hard as Gary. U.S. Steel cut thousands of jobs in the 1970s and 1980s. Production at the mills actually picked up in the 80s and 90s, and they're producing as much steel as ever, but automation had rendered most jobs obsolete. By the 1990s, only about 6,000 people worked in the steel mills. What happens when a hastily built company town sees massive job losses from its primary employer, while also succumbing to extreme levels of white flight? Well, Gary's population plummeted. By 1990, only 116,000 people lived in the city. The population freefall continues to the present day. The recently released 2020 census shows Gary is home to only 69,000 people.
69?
It's lost over 100,000
69?
residents in 60 years. Today, only about 3,000 people work at the plant. Cities aren't designed to lose population, especially not this fast. As cities grow, they add infrastructure like sewers, power lines, schools, libraries, and roads. Tax dollars pay for those services. When most people leave, the infrastructure is still there and costs money to maintain and operate. Without tax revenues, these services can fall into disrepair. That's what's happening in Gary. 70,000 people who can't pay for a city meant for 170,000. As a result, the city is using what little money they have to demolish buildings, most notably its empty public schools. It's cheaper to demolish them than maintain them empty. Today, Gary only has one public high school left. It used to have a half a dozen. Many of Gary's churches are also empty and falling apart. There aren't enough people left to fill the pews. Is it possible to pull Gary out of this nosedive?
Nope.
Well, on
Gary's
paper, Gary has some real positive attributes. It's still close to the city of Chicago, and you can catch a commuter rail that will take you to Millennium Station. Gary is also unique because its boundaries overlap with a national park, Indiana Dunes. It has a minor league baseball team, the Railcats, who can still draw a crowd on game days. Miller Beach, a wealthier and whiter enclave of Gary, still has some life left in it. And housing, unsurprisingly, is extremely affordable here. The city's been trying to promote its airport as an option for a third Chicago airport. O'Hare and Midway are operating at capacity, and there is significant local opposition to expanding O'Hare. The state of Illinois wants to build an airport in-state, but Gary's airport could easily be upgraded to handle significant passenger volumes. If that happens, it would give Gary another economic engine besides steel. Schools and infrastructure remain a big concern, however. Gary has closed so many of its neighborhood schools that families may not want to relocate to the area. The biggest barrier, however, may simply be perception. In the 1990s, Gary was rife with gang activity and violence. It's doing better today, but an entire generation of people associate Gary with that reputation. But if you drive through Gary and look past the overgrown lots and empty streets, you see an amazing history. It had once been thriving, and I hesitate to count Gary out. It faces problems greater than any city its size, and it has since it was founded back in 1906. But there is beauty here too, and I hope that the days of a growing Gary come soon. If Gary does make a comeback, it will truly be a fascinating story.
Yeah,
the kind of story you might
there'll
find
be a
in one
quote
of the
paying hell
frequent
before that
short
happens.
articles posted in Morning Brew, a free daily newsletter delivered to your inbox every day of the week. Morning Brew keeps you up to speed on all the news and current events you need to know about business, finance, and tech.
Avoid at all
5
costs.
minutes in a way that's more informative, witty, and relevant than traditional news. It cuts through the clutter and gives you what you need every morning. For example, when I was writing this script, I got to read about an update on the broken international supply chain, a Chinese real estate development group on the verge of collapse.
Oh, it's because I'm not talking. Worst cities in the U.S.
Realtors understand that it's not just the most important decision you may ever make. It's your American dream.
I just found out July is anything for Cats Month at PetSmart. That means more deep.
Let's see, worst cities in the entire country. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, partially New York. What's it called? It's not, I think, Louisville. That's also a bad spot. Peoria. Mount Vernon, Illinois. East St. Louis. Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon, Chicago, and East St. Louis have to be on this list, or else I lose.
I'll put a chapter timestamp you can skip to, but I want to go over the methodology for this video because this list is going to look a lot different than other videos like this. Every city has plenty of negative things going on there. You have traffic and crowds and congestion, pollution, noise, crime, just all the hassles and frustrations you have to put up with to live in a big city. But why do folks put up with all those negative things? Well, they put up with it to get some of the positive things that cities have to offer. I think just about everybody would agree that restaurants and shopping are two things that are very important about living in a city, and I think the vast majority of people would think that at least some of the following are also important. So whether it's bars or microbreweries or nightlife or live music or live theater, pro sports, whether it be major league or minor league, or maybe the sports bars or bowling alleys or billiards or botanical gardens, zoos, art museum, the high arts like ballet or opera or symphony, rock climbing walls, bike trails, just all kind of stuff that people want to get out of the city. I mean, most people aren't going to be into all that stuff, but pretty much everyone's going to be into at least a few of those things. The term I use is return on investment. You're investing your time, you're investing your patience and frustrations into putting up with all these negative things about cities in hopes you're going to get some of these positive things. And like I was saying before, most other lists like this are only going to talk about housing costs and crime and talking about what makes it a good or a bad city, and they're not going to talk at all about some of these city amenities, things that are positive about cities. But I would say the most important things to somebody are low housing costs, low crime. They don't care about some of those positive things about cities, and a city probably isn't the best place for that person. So you can get much more out of what you want in life from a small town. Low housing costs, low crime, it doesn't have those amenities you don't care about. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the 10 cities I think give the worst return on investment and what makes these the 10 worst cities in the U.S. At number 10 is Dallas, and right off the bat, I'm probably
Dallas, Texas? Seriously?
Dallas is very popular. A lot of people love it, and it's growing a lot. It's the 9th biggest city in the country with about 1.3 million people. Dallas County is the 8th most populous county in the U.S. at 2.7 million, and the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex has over 7.8 million people. It's the 5th largest metro in the U.S. And there are a lot of great things about Dallas, a lot of great neighborhoods. Deep Ellum is kind of your younger, hipper nightlife kind of area with a lot of live music and restaurants and bars. Town is another area with a lot of local boutiques and restaurants. Oaklawn is one of the most vibrant neighborhoods in America. You have an area called Knox Henderson, I think, which is a lot of upscale luxury type stuff, and a lot of great neighborhoods in Dallas. So all that is great. Why have it on this list? Again, 7.8 million people in the Metroplex. It doesn't really feel like the top of the city amenities. So, for example, that's twice the size as Denver Metro. Dallas doesn't offer twice as much as what Denver does. Atlanta has, quote-unquote, only 6 million people, but Atlanta has more kind of big city, big-time stuff there. To me, it feels like a smaller city, like the city's ranked more in the 15th to 20th ranking, so more like Denver or the Twin Cities kind of metro area where it's way bigger than those, but it doesn't really feel any more big time than those. At number 9 is Baltimore, Maryland. You look at a bunch of lists like this, and Baltimore is often going to be number 1 or certainly in the top 3 in terms of worst cities. And a lot of the problems with Baltimore are pretty well documented. It has a declining population. There's about 590,000 people in the city. It's the 30th largest city in the U.S., and Baltimore County has about 830,000 people, but Baltimore County is a completely separate entity from the city of Baltimore. It's one of the most important cities in terms of U.S. history. It's home to a lot of great historic neighborhoods, including Federal Hill, which is where Fort McHenry is, and also an area called Fells Point, which is very historic. This is more of your bar and nightlife kind of entertainment district. And there's some other nice neighborhoods there. You have the Hampton area, which is kind of like your gentrified area, but it's kind of hip and young with a lot of local boutiques and restaurants. And then you have the Inner Harbor, which is kind of like the main touristy type area right in the heart of downtown. But it's kind of gone downhill in recent years. But even before it was going downhill, it still wasn't all that great. It's kind of like your typical touristy area with your chain restaurants like Bubba Gump's and Ruth's Chris and the Hard Rock Cafe. And even though I'm not using crime as a number 1 indicator of what makes a bad city, you can't overlook the fact that Baltimore has incredibly high crime rates. And what makes things worse for Baltimore is that because it's so close to D.C., which is very expensive, Baltimore itself is not anywhere near as cheap as it should be. But the positive things about Baltimore nowhere near match the size of the city and don't even come close to making up for some of the negatives. At number 8 is Los Angeles, and this is the 2nd largest city in the U.S., about 3.9 million people in the U.S. Los Angeles County is the most populous county in the U.S. at right about 10 million people. However, over the past few years, there has been declining in population. And of course, if you're talking about big-time, international, world city kind of stuff, LA is certainly going to be like that. It has a lot of wonderful things about the city. You have everything from the world-class chefs and nightlife and the music scene and, of course, the beaches and just being outdoor in that wonderful weather. But when I talk about return on investment, your investment in LA is crazy. I mean, the time, the hassle, just the frustration of putting up with LA just drives you absolutely crazy. On top of the fact that the monetary investment was really expensive to live there. And for all the wonderful things you can get out of LA, things you can only do there and nowhere else in the world, I don't think it makes up for all the hassle you have to put up with. But what it comes down to is that it's just too big. It's just too much. And that's not just me saying that. People are leaving the city, so people are willing to put up with the high cost of living in San Diego or Santa Barbara, which are still growing, or San Jose. But for LA, they aren't because it's just too freaking big. At number 7 is Birmingham, Alabama. There's a population of about 207,000 people, and it's declining. And the metro area has just over 1 million people, and it's gaining slightly. The median house value is $99,000. There's a 25% poverty rate and a very high crime rate. There are some decent neighborhoods in the city. Downtown is okay, but the main entertainment and nightlife area is called 5 Points South. It's near the UAB college campus. And the
Birmingham sucks too.
Restaurants and bars and nightlife stuff, and some good historic homes there as well. An area that we actually like, we'll go down to Birmingham every now and then to visit an area called Homewood. Got like a nice little main street there, some local businesses, and some pretty cool shops. All of those things are okay, but again, there's a metro area of over 1 million people, so it doesn't really offer as much as other cities of that same size range. That's going to be the theme for the next few on this list, to just feel a lot smaller than what it really is. At number 6 is Rochester, New York, and it's in a pretty similar boat as Birmingham. The city has a population of about 200,000, and the metro area has just over 1 million, and both are declining. There's a 25% poverty rate and a high crime rate to go along with it. But the reason why it's on this list is that it's way too big to offer the little that it does. The downtown is pretty weak, especially compared to other cities in this size range, and the main kind of entertainment and restaurant areas are along Park Avenue and Monroe Avenue, which are okay for a city significantly smaller. Rochester is almost as big as Buffalo in terms of population, but it's nowhere near as big as Buffalo in terms of feel. It just has the feel of a significantly smaller city, but with a bunch of skyscrapers downtown that makes it look bigger. And it's a pretty cheap place to live. Houses are cheap, so those really high New York property taxes aren't going to affect you that much. But people are still leaving because there's just no job opportunities, and there just really isn't much to keep you there. Similar to Birmingham and Rochester, at number 5 is Dayton, Ohio. There are about 140,000 people in the city with a slight decline in population, a little over 1 million people in the metro area with a slight decline in population, but there is a little bit of growth in the northern and southern suburbs, however. It has a 30% poverty rate and a median house value of $68,000. So you combine that with fairly low taxes in Ohio, and the overall cost of living in Dayton is pretty low. But it's pretty similar to Rochester in a lot of ways, including how the downtown is just not that impressive, although it does look kind of impressive in terms of the high-rises. The main historic and entertainment district in the city is called the Oregon Historic District. This is where you have a lot of local boutiques and bars and restaurants. But this is pretty underwhelming for the largest city in the metro area, over 1 million people. And it hurts Dayton to be kind of sandwiched in between two much more interesting big cities, with Cincinnati being about 45 minutes to the southwest and Columbus being about an hour east. Now, there are some pretty nice outdoor type stuff in the area, some whitewater kayaking right in the middle of downtown, and some other interesting walking and biking trails throughout the metro area, but it's nowhere near enough to make up for the fact that this really doesn't offer a whole lot for a metro area of over 1 million people. And number 4 is Hartford, Connecticut, and just like Birmingham, Rochester, and Dayton, the population is going down. There's about 120,000 people in the city. The overall metro area has about 1.3 million people, and that's also declining. There's a 27% poverty rate and a pretty high crime rate as well. The median house value is $173,000, which is low compared to the rest of the U.S., but it's fairly high compared to other cities in this category that are also struggling economically. There are some decent neighborhoods in the city. The downtown is okay. The main entertainment district is along Front Street, which has some decent shops and restaurants and bars and stuff. And the gentrified area is Parkville, but it isn't crazy. It's not super hipster and cool, which I guess is not necessarily a bad thing for a gentrified area. But at the same time, the city is really struggling. A lot of poverty, a lot of jobs leaving. There isn't really much going on in terms of economic development, and the city was pretty close to filing for bankruptcy. But the main reason why I had Hartford ranked worse than Birmingham, Rochester, or Dayton, even though they're all kind of similar size, is that those are all pretty cheap. Hartford is not that cheap, but housing is kind of expensive, and taxes are kind of
That
high
is
too.
crazy. 200,000 for that
So
small
this is
little
one of
house.
those videos going to take kind of a surprising turn. At number 3 is Phoenix, Arizona. The city has a population of about 1.7 million people. It's the 5th largest city in the U.S. It's located within Maricopa County, which has about 4.5 million. That's the 4th most populous county in the country, and the overall Phoenix metro area has over 5 million people. It's the 12th most populous metro in the U.S. The reason why I have Phoenix ranked so high on this list is that it's just kind of an underwhelming city for something of its size. It's huge, but doesn't feel anywhere near as big as other cities in this size range. So like I was saying in the beginning of the video, Dallas feels like a much smaller city, maybe like about the size of Phoenix, and Phoenix feels like a much smaller city, more like in this range of, say, St. Louis. There are some interesting neighborhoods in the city. The downtown is okay, but underwhelming for such a big city. There's an area called the Cityscape, which has got some entertainment and shopping, but it's not anything spectacular. There are areas called Roosevelt Row, some nice boutiques and nightlife and restaurants, but again, it's just not anything spectacular compared to other cities in the size range like Seattle or Denver. And some of the best things about the Phoenix metro area aren't in the city of Phoenix itself, such as Old Town Scottsdale, which is kind of like your luxury boutiques and nightlife kind of stuff in the suburb of Scottsdale. Or in the suburb of Tempe, which is the home to Arizona State University, you have Mill Avenue, which is like your main party nightlife, just crazy bar and nightlife scene. And so you compare that to other cities in the size range, again, like Seattle or Denver, or also like Detroit or Tampa, just has much more of a personality, much more of a unique feel. There's things to those places, only in those places where Phoenix feels more like it's a giant suburb. So I want to once again bring up return on investment to big cities. A lot of traffic and congestion, a lot of hassle and frustration putting into the big city stuff, but what you get in return isn't as much as you would get in other cities of the size range. So that's why Phoenix ranked so high on this list. At number 2 is Las Vegas, and when I say Vegas is a bad city, I'm not saying as a place to go. It's a great place to visit. I've been there at least 10 times or so, and you can have a great time going there and hanging out, but I'm talking about the actual city itself. The city of Las Vegas has a population of about 660,000 people. It's the 27th largest city in the U.S. Clark County, in which it lies, has about 2.3 million people, which makes it the 11th most populous county in the country. And the overall Vegas metropolitan area has 2.3 million people, and it's the 27th largest metro in the U.S. So it isn't just a big tourist destination, it's also a really big city. Now, I assure you, I didn't just scour the internet looking for these area photographs to make Vegas look really bad. This is actually what the majority of Metro Las Vegas looks like. The vast majority of the development in the Las Vegas area has been in the past 20 to 30 years, so what you see in terms of development and subdivision is that new mantra of development that you've seen in the past 20, 30 years. And so here's an aerial photograph of one of the more quote-unquote older and established suburbs called Spring Valley. And even the older type suburbs look kind of the same as the newer ones, just has no soul to it. So earlier I ripped on Rochester for having just a small little area that's kind of unique, got some interesting local boutiques and stuff, and Dayton also, but Vegas doesn't have any of that kind of stuff. It's all just this giant suburb, all very cookie cutter, no soul, no personality. So look at places like Tucson, Arizona, or Albuquerque, New Mexico, or El Paso, Texas, other desert-type cities that are much smaller than Vegas and have a soul. There's an identity to them. There's a personality. There's cool neighborhoods. There's things about those places that make it unique to those places, where Vegas is basically one giant suburban subdivision. And by law of averages, there are going to be people watching this video that live in Las Vegas, and please let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to know what people like about Las Vegas. What is the draw to living there? Because I just don't get it. And so now we get to what I think is the worst city in the U.S., and if you've been with this channel for a while, you know exactly what it is, and that's beautiful Orlando, Florida. The city itself has about 300,000 people. Orange County, which it lies, has about 1.5 million, and the Orlando metropolitan area has over 3 million people. It's ranked about 17th or 18th in terms of overall U.S. metros. It's huge and growing very, very quickly. And I never technically lived in Orlando, but my wife went to graduate school at the University of Central Florida, which is there.
I'm getting a little bit of a headache, bruh. Oh, why? My dad told you to say that he said hi. Oh god, I'm getting a little bit of a headache, bro. It's annoying. Alright. Yeah. I'm here. Hello. Look how great this place is.
I spent a lot of time down there and just learned to really like this place. But the reasons why I hate Orlando so much are basically the same reasons about Vegas. It's just all recent development of the past 20 to 30 years, and everything is just very sterile, very overly planned. A lot of homeowners associations, a lot of new cookie-cutter subdivisions. There's just no soul or personality to the city. So here's a satellite image of the area to give you an idea just how spread out it is. Everything is flat, so they have to have a lot of areas that are set aside for drainage. There's all kinds of different ponds. You have all these lakes and all these areas that you don't build on. And then again, a lot of areas that aren't lakes are sinkholes. So you just have to avoid all this stuff. So everything just takes up way more space than it really should. And it takes way more time to cross a city than it should. And all that is exacerbated by the fact that it has really expensive toll roads. All the freeways going through the metro area are toll roads with the exception of Interstate 4. And depending on how long your commute is, these tolls can be really expensive. It's not out of the question that you might pay over $1,000 a year in tolls. It's crazy. So with it being so inauthentic and artificial and just being so spread out and crowded, all the tourists and the tolls, and it just has no personality or soul to it. And on top of that, there's no beach. That's why I think Orlando is the worst city in the U.S. And just like Vegas, please do let me know in the
I'm here, you know that, right? Winded. Well, that explains it. Building a parking garage. No. I might want to play trivia here in a second. I might actually go eat dinner. I have a headache. I wonder if it's from like being hungry or something. You have to kill, you have to get goodie bags, which can be, which only drop on Halloween, or you have to kill, or just fend off a pumpkin moon, and you have to wait for them to drop. But if we can work towards something like that if you want. Have you seen the memes where it's just like a bunch of crabs and it's just voiceover by Mr. Krabs and there's like money, money, and then something like awful happens. I saw that, but I saw a video where like a bunch of crabs got crammed into a can. I'm all out of Just die on Skulk. Dude, if I ever had to fall to my death, I couldn't do, and I didn't have a bucket of water, and I had Skulk sensor on, I would place that right as I die. With my levels, I could infect the world. Person is level 21,000, literally dies with amount of XP. I'm gonna take a small break stream. I'm on stream, but I'm gonna experiment with this. Okay, so we all know that it's okay. We don't just watch my video, watch my stream. Okay, we're gonna kick this in the creative. We're gonna just call it E. Create. We're going to do an experiment. So theoretically, we should have a ton of spread range. So when something dies near a catalyst, oh my god, that's a pretty nice seed. Is that? Oh no, that can't be where. Oh my god, why you should start a survival. I know you have another. You should start a survival thing on this seed because look at this. This is a plateau. This is perfect for a kingdom. Holy crap! And then there's gonna be a village nearby. Look at that, dude. Imagine that. If there was ocean on this side, like not too far, I would make this my country seed. That's a really great view right there for a scenic highway. Let's do it on top of this hill, just because I want to. It's got on nature, and it should, yep, it's right here. Yeah, sure, maybe. Okay,